with me. Okay. All right. You're being recorded right now, everybody. Welcome to Virtual Talks at 2. My name's Margarita Sandino. I am the Director of Education at the Dixon, and I work closely with Lindley Schmidt, who organized this wonderful talk today. Way back in the day, I used to lead and host a lot of the meetings. I've been at the Dixon for 13 years, so some of you might see me around or see me pass running around or something. But it's good to be here today. So a couple of things. I will mute everybody. Sometimes we unmute ourselves without knowing we're doing it. Or like me, I didn't know how to mute myself for a long time. So I'll go ahead and do that. And then also remember that this talk will be on our YouTube channel. So after the fact, if you need to leave early or if you want to share this with friends and kind of watch it again, you'll be able to do so, right? So today we have a very special treat. I'm excited to see Heather here. This is Heather Nichols. I am going to tell you a little bit about her. But before that, okay, one more thing. When we start the talk, please remember to, on the bottom of your screen, there's a little bubble that says chat. So if you have any questions as we go along our talk, please make sure you enter them there. And then at the end of the talk, I will kind of share those with Heather and we'll start a little conversation. So make sure you identify that before we get started. Great. So I have Heather's information here. I'm really excited. I met Heather. I was talking to her when we joined probably like a year ago. It seems like I've met her 5 years ago. You know, I know time has changed these days, the way it works. So I'm glad to be here, at least with you, at least virtually. So I'll tell you a little bit about Heather. Heather Nichols is the Joyce Blackmon Curatorial Fellow of African American Art and Art of the African Diaspora. She received her bachelor's cum laude in art history from Barnard College of Columbia University in New York in 2016 and received the highest departmental honor on her undergraduate thesis on representations of domestic workers and servants in 18th century French art. She later completed her master's degrees in history of art from the Curatorial Institute of Art in London, England, in 2019, where she received a distinction overall and on her dissertation, which focused on the Little Paris Group, a Black-led artist and teacher collective active in Washington, D.C. in the mid to late 1940s and into the 1950s. She has provided research support to several exhibitions, most notably the MoMA exhibition, Bodies Ezek Kingalis, City Dreams, that's in 2018, and Posing Modernity, the Black model from Manet and Matisse to today, 2018 as well. Since arriving at the Memphis Brooks Museum of Art in December 2019, she has curated a small gallery show featuring works from the permanent collection entitled A Journey Toward Self-Definition, African American Artists in the Permanent Collection, which was wonderful. I got to see it with a personal tour. It was great. She is currently organizing an exhibition for this summer. Everybody get ready. Entitled Persevere and Resist, The Strong Black Women of Elizabeth Catlett, which will open on June 5th, 2021 at the Memphis Brooks Museum of Art. So I hope after you hear Heather talking and all this information, you mark your calendars for June 5th to go see her exhibition at the Memphis Brooks Museum. So I will now, we'll all now virtually give Heather Nichols a big hand. Thank you for being here, and we're excited about this. Thank you. So,
yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Hopefully everyone's doing all right. And for those of you who lost power or water, hopefully it's come back to normal at least. And thank you for coming and attending virtually this talk. I thought I would start off with sort of an overview or format for the talk. I think it's always super important to begin with definitions so that we're all on the same page. As you know, the talk is talking about Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. So I thought I would start off with some definitions and terms, and then look at specific examples within the Dixon's collection. After that, I thought I would then go into a number of works in the Dixon's collection by Black artists, and we can discuss those a bit. And then the second half of the talk, I'll discuss a bit about the project that I worked on, Posing Modernity, where I worked as a project research associate for about 2 years, and then we can open up to questions. And hopefully that's all right with everyone. And I'm excited for the questions at the end. Before starting, I kind of wanted to make a quick note about the presentation. Some of the titles of the works that I'm going to be discussing have terms in them that are now considered by many, by mainstream art history, to be offensive and dated. And I'm only using them to reference the original title by the artist, but will generally always accompany that by an updated title, which reflects our current times. So without further ado, wanted to begin with the definition of Impressionism. I've included here a definition from the Tate. They have a really wonderful resource on their website, which includes important art terms. They define Impressionism as Impressionism developed in France in the 19th century and is based on the practice of painting out of doors and spontaneously on the spot rather than in a studio from sketches. This is also known by painting outside. It's also known in French as plein air. And of course, this is something that was very much breaking away from traditional art approaches that were practiced in these very rigid and hierarchical academies that kind of determined what good or bad art was at the time. So I thought I would include an example of an Impressionist work in the Dixon's collection. Many of you may be familiar with the work of Claude Monet. This is Porte of Dieppe, Evening, from 1882. Monet, as most of you may already know, was one of the artists most associated with the Impressionist movement, along with other artists such as Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, Camille Pissarro, Berthe Morisot, and Edouard Manet. One thing to note on the list I just mentioned, there's only one woman, Berthe Morisot, and many of the artists I just mentioned are other artists who are included in the Dixon's permanent collection. So I would highly advise everyone to go and visit whenever you can, or visit their Google Arts and Cultures page online. So, second term is Post-Impressionism, which is a term that describes the changes in Impressionism from about 1886, which was the date of the last Impressionist group show in Paris. Again, this is a definition from the Tate's resources. Some of these changes that they are referencing are a rejection of the rigid limitations of the Impressionists. Often they opted to use vivid colors as opposed to natural ones of their predecessors, and they tended to apply paint with a thicker coat. The artists best associated with this movement were Paul Gauguin, Georges Seurat, Vincent van Gogh, and Paul Cézanne. In the case of Paul Cézanne, whose work is featured in the Dixon's collection, was very interested in exploring geometric forms and distorting forms in order to achieve this very expressive and exaggerated outcome. This particular work, Trees and Rocks near the Chateau Noir from 1900 to 1906 approximately, is one of the most, is a good example of his fixation on creating landscape paintings that often, as I mentioned, distorted various objects such as rocks or hills to create more geometric shapes. Paul Cézanne was an interesting character for many reasons, but he opted to live his life primarily in the south of France, as opposed to Paris, the booming metropolis of Paris. And he was largely influential to many of his peers and younger artists in the day. As you can see, is this work, he's embracing what will be later known as Cubism, and a 20th century avant-garde art movement that dominated the early half of the 20th century. So, the artists I mentioned so far are not Black. And so I wanted to make sure on the last day of Black History Month to honor some of the Black artists in the Dixon's collection. The first artist is probably the least well-known of the ones I'll mention. His name is Charles Ethan Porter, and he was primarily a still life painter for the majority of his life, and is often associated with other Black artists working around the same time, such as Robert Duncanson, Edward Mitchell Bannister, and Henry Ossabaw Tanner, who I'll later talk about a bit later. He attended the National Academy of Design in New York and was one of the first African-American artists to exhibit there. He found support in other artists and luminaries such as Mark Twain, and lived in Paris, like many Black artists of the day, for about 3 years. During that period, he studied at the École Nationale Supérieure des Arts Décoratifs, which is one of the preeminent art schools, as well as the private art school, the Académie Julian, which welcomed a number of artists while it was open, a number of whom are here: the Brazilian modernist Tarsila, Thomas Hart Benton, who many of you may know as this realist, social realist and regional artist, Émile Bernard and Pierre Bonnard, who are both French artists, and Louise Bourgeois, who was a French-American artist. The late David Driscoll, who was an art historian, curator, and artist, who unfortunately passed away last year from complications due to COVID, wrote about Porter many years ago and said the following: "His relative obscurity until recent years is perhaps due in part to the fact that his work had little exposure outside Springfield, Hartford, and Rockville, all in Connecticut, communities where he lived the most productive years of his life. It is also due in part to the fact that Porter, like Bannister, Lewis, and Tanner, experienced racial prejudice in his day. Artists of color were often neglected because of their race, and more often were rebuffed when they tried to exhibit their work in the exhibition halls of the nation. Although his art was seldom exhibited and relatively unknown until recent years, there now has occurred a lively interest in the life and work of Charles Ethan Porter, one of Connecticut's Black artists." So for those of you who are less familiar with him, I urge you, with all the artists that I'm mentioning, to, if you are particularly interested in their work, to explore them a bit further. This is not a work in the Dixon's collection, but it was one that I stumbled across when doing a bit of research for this presentation. And I was particularly stunned by it because it's from 1880. It's called Boy and Book, and it's watercolor. And I was particularly stunned by it because not only is it not what he generally does, which are these still life works of scenes of plants and flowers and fruit, but it's an example of a work where he depicts the human body, and within that, the Black body, at a time when I imagine that was quite rare. Again, the date is 1880, so not too long after the Civil War. I also wanted to include it because it is a relatively, in my mind, positive image, in that it doesn't show despair or explicitly show despair or the plights of African Americans. Rather, it shows a young man engaging with text, with literature, and to me it feels quite hopeful and optimistic at a time when, again, that would likely have been quite rare. The two works that are in the Dixon's collection, this is the first, Bowl of Cherries, from around 1890. Porter, again, was very fond of creating these still life images. In terms of the hierarchy, though, within art forms, within Western art, the still life very much occupied the lowest rung, and is often associated with studies produced in studios at art academies. Porter is interesting in my mind in many ways, but mostly because he's embracing this genre at a time when it was not in fashion, and stuck with that throughout his life. The second work in the Dixon's collection by Porter is Sunflowers, from around 1880, so a similar timeline. This work is closely related to another work with the same title from the early 1880s, which is in the Baltimore Museum of Art's collection. I think what's interesting about these two works, and I'll show the second one, the related work, is that they have these very strange, elongated compositions. They've been described as vertical studies by some scholars that have extremely expressive brushwork and strokes on top of a very dark background. And I think, again, Porter is taking this very conventional and sometimes disregarded or seen as less on the rungs of fine arts, seen as less interesting and less prestigious to be following that, taking that conventional dull genre and putting his spin on it by playing with composition. So the second artist that I want to discuss in the Dixon's collection is the sculptor and art teacher, Augusta Savage. Hopefully some of you were fortunate enough to see the Savage show at the Dixon pre-pandemic, which feels like a billion years ago. I was fortunate enough to see it both at the Dixon and also in New York in an earlier iteration. If you weren't able to see it or didn't hear about it, Dr. Ernestine Jenkins at U of M did a wonderful talk. I don't know if it's recorded, but I would highly recommend into it. There's also a catalog that was produced as well. This is a more contemporary example that I'm showing you, and definitely falls outside of this Impressionist, Post-Impressionist timeline, but is another work that I wanted to focus on. Augusta Savage was primarily a sculptor, but also worked as an art teacher. She founded an art school. She was known for directing the Harlem Community Arts Center during her life. And like many Black artists, found a home both as a mentor for younger artists in community centers and community spaces, as well as having their own art practice. She attended the Cooper Union in New York and later went to Paris, again, like many African-American artists at the early 20th century, and studied at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière in Paris. Other artists who maybe some of you know, African-American artists who studied there, were Herbert Gentry and Laura Wheeler Waring, whose work I will show a little bit later. Savage is probably best known for her 16-foot massive plaster sculpture titled Lift Every Voice and Sing, otherwise referred to as HARP, which was produced on commission for the 1939 New York World's Fair. She was only one of 4 women asked to create a work, and only one of two African Americans receive a commission. Unfortunately, I feel like the story of the destruction of the work has become almost as famous, or not more famous, than the production of the work itself. The work was so large and she was unable to find the funds to store the work that it was destroyed. So unfortunately, all we have are images from the time to show us what that work would have looked like. Smaller versions of the work have been produced, but this is the original, as you can see in photograph. As you can see, the sculpture depicts a group of 12 stylized Black singers who are in graduated heights that symbolize the strings of a harp. The sounding board was formed by the hand and arm of God, and a kneeling man holding music represented the foot pedal. This work, however, by Augusta Savage, is in the Dixon's collection. Savage produced a number of smaller versions of this work. Initially, it was a life-size bronze sculpture. It's entitled Gammon, and is best translated in French to street urchin, but was reportedly modeled actually after Savage's nephew. Aside from her, the story of Lift Every Voice, I think that Gammon is probably one of her best known works today and can be seen in a number of collections around the United States. But obviously it's great to have one here in Memphis. It was because of this particular work, the original, that the president of the Rosenwald Fund, which was a scholarship created to support Black artists in the early mid-20th century, that she received her first fellowship, which allowed her to travel to Paris. The president of the Rosenwald Fund at the time actually bought a cast of this piece for his own collection, as he was so enthralled. This is particularly one of my favorites in the Dixon's collection, in part because at a time in 1929, when depictions of African Americans were defined by negatives, struggle of hardship, and that which is lacking, representations of Black people such as this, which are dignified, was quite radical. Something that I kind of continue to circle back to, and probably will throughout this presentation, is the importance of representation, but also the type of representation that we are experiencing. And so that will kind of come full circle, I think, at the end, and hopefully we can talk a bit about that as well. The last artist I want to talk about is Henry Ossawa Tanner, who I think is probably one of the better known artists. He was likely more well known to general audiences than I think the other two I've mentioned. He was a painter, studied at PAFA in Philadelphia. He's often considered the first African-American artist, visual artist, to receive international acclaim. And to many African-American artists who were going to Paris, he was very much a role model and acted as a mentor very informally to a number of artists. He was best known for his biblical scenes, He was accepted into the 1896 Salon in Paris for his work Daniel in the Lion's Den, which the Salon, of course, in Paris was very much considered the authority on art at the time. So this was a very big deal. He also created biblical works such as the Annunciation and Disciples Seeing Christ Walking on the Water. I think in the example on the right, circling back to Impressionism, you can see definitely inspiration from the methods that the Impressionists were using. I also think that these two are also pretty well known within Tanner's work, although they are not explicitly religious. These two works, the Banjo Lesson on the left and the Thankful Poor on the right, show a certain amount of intimacy that, again, was very rare at the time to see in visual art, but also very much honors the struggles and references the poverty the African Americans were experiencing, again, post-Civil War. I wanted to include this work, which is a charcoal and paper work at SAM in Washington, D.C. Tanner actually worked with the Red Cross during World War I and occasionally created works that depicted Black soldiers. This is one that I came across doing research a few years ago and that has very much stayed in my mind because when I first saw it, I initially was drawn to the black figure. And again, this was quite rare at the time to show examples of Black soldiers, and of course, then thinking about the treatment they received when they returned home. This, though, however, is the work in the collection that is by Tanner. It's called View of the Seine Looking Towards Notre Dame. For those of you who've been fortunate enough to travel to Paris and maybe have strolled along the Seine, this should look very familiar. And again, just like the earlier work I mentioned, there's a sense that he's embracing these very fleeting moments, the sort of how the light hits at a particular moment. And that was very much the techniques of the Impressionists. So this is the second half of the presentation, which we'll be looking at one particular show, the show that I worked on a few years ago, called Posing Modernity, the Black Model from Manet, Matisse to Today, and in its French iteration, Le Modèle Noir de Géricault à Matisse, which traveled to Paris. This was the exhibition catalog that accompanied the American English version of the show, which opened October 24th, 2018, and closed February 10th, 2019. For those of you who are not familiar with it, I would encourage you to check it out. One update is that unfortunately it's sold out everywhere. And if you try to buy it used, you may be asked to spend about $1,000. So I think there's a third printing underway, which may make that a bit easier and lessen the costs. But if you can find a copy, I highly encourage you to check it out. A bit about the show. It premiered at the Wallach Art Gallery, which is in Harlem, Columbia University in New York, and later traveled to France. It is based off of the dissertation by Dr. Denise Bell, who's currently based at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And her dissertation, which she finished in 2013, was entitled Seeing Lore, Race and Modernity from Manet's Olympia to Matisse, Bearden, and Beyond. And essentially, it was revolutionary for many reasons, in part because the premise of the exhibition and the dissertation was to trace the Black model and its centrality to the development of Western modern art, beginning with Manet's Olympia, which is, for anyone who's taken an Art History 101 course, you will definitely have covered it, but I'll show an image of it and may seem familiar for anyone else. As a short note, I became involved in this project because Dr. Morell and I both shared the same advisor, only I was completing my undergraduate thesis, but as was mentioned earlier, I was exploring either underrepresented groups or misrepresented groups, particularly those of color, in European art, and came on as a project research associate for about 2 years to assist with various topics. Some of you may have seen the numerous write-ups on the show, and I've included a handful in this, but I encourage you to read them if you haven't. Most of the articles written focused on Olympia, as I mentioned, which is the main catalyst for the project, which is this image at center here, which may seem very familiar. Again, Art Forum's article as well. Others included other images from the exhibition, such as this one. This was Jeanne Duval, who was nicknamed the Black Venus. She was the mistress to the poet Charles Baudelaire, and was also painted by Manet. In the exhibition and catalog, Morel insisted that, quote, there was a Black presence in avant-garde circles when artists and writers defied convention, also including when interracial socializing was taboo. Aside for it being a really very rich and powerful show, it yielded some very positive, tangible outcomes that began to shift the way that many of us think of the field, and those of us who are working in the field get really excited about. For one, some of the works ended up being renamed as part of the exhibition. I wanted to include this quote, which is quite long, from one of the articles I took a screenshot of in one of the earlier slides. This is from Dr. Morel, talking about her experience at Columbia. She says, every student of art history will at some point come across Edouard Manet's Olympia, a painting widely considered as a foundational work of modern art. Denise Morel recalls the moment the lecture slide first flashed up on the screen when she was a graduate student at Columbia. My heart started beating a little faster, Morel says, remembering how she took in the white nude, the prostitute Olympia, and the Black servant in equal measure, leaning in to listen closely to what followed. I'm really curious to hear what the instructor was going to say about the Black servant, Morel explains. Is it going to be in racial terms? Is he going to explicitly express the fact that she's Black? And will it be in terms that I'm not going to find outdated in terms of current thinking about issues of race? Instead, the professor spoke about Olympia without mentioning the maid figure in the image, which bothered Morel more than anything that might have been said about her. From my perspective, she was there in plain view. I saw her just as clearly as I saw the white prostitute, but to ignore her, to say nothing about her, to not acknowledge her presence rendered her invisible. So Laure, who is the Black model in that Olympia image, was actually depicted many times by Manet. He used two other examples, which were both in the exhibition. On the left, obviously, you have a portrait, which includes the more outdated term, also Portrait of Laure from 1863, which is in an Italian collection. And to the right, Edouard Manet's Enfants aux Tuileries, the Tuileries Gardens in Paris. As you can see, both these paintings depict Laure, but they're very different in that Laure, of course, in the left is central. It's a portrait. She is the central figure. And yet in the image on the right, you have her almost at the periphery, kind of off screen. And I think that in many cases, it's indicative of the way that Black subjects are depicted in Western paintings. They very much exist at this periphery. In the case of Madeline, which was the name of the sitter in this painting, there's an additional dimension, the nudity and potential exoticization of the Black female body. This was a painting that was titled that first name for about 200 years. And it wasn't until research conducted during this exhibition that research that was rigorous and intentional discovered that this woman's name was actually Madeline. And so the institution changed the name of the work in honor of that. As Dr. Morel said, in the case of many works of Black sitters and models, their true identities were eclipsed from art history by racism and stereotyping and hidden behind unnecessary racial references, which in many cases comes from a very troubling place. So I think that there are some really wonderful and timely things that have come out of that exhibition. And obviously as a curator who's looking at these types of exhibitions, it's a very exciting time to be working in the field. These are a number of paintings that were featured in the exhibition. For those of you who these images may seem unfamiliar, I encourage you to look up the artist names, which I'll read off. You've got William H. Johnson's work, the top left. You've got Frédéric Bazille in the second from the left, Henri Matisse, Laura Wheeler-Waring, Mickalene Thomas, Edouard Manet again, Charles Alston, all of whom were very important African-American artists. And Mickalene Thomas, of course, is a contemporary artist. The exhibition traced the Black model, of course, starting with Manet, but very much into contemporary art. And so I'll show some images of the installation and kind of how the chronology of the exhibition worked. This is a pre-pandemic project, but the Wallach actually created a virtual walkthrough of the exhibition. So I know these days we're kind of used to virtual walkthroughs and virtual talks, but actually in 2018, they created a virtual walkthrough of the exhibition that you can actually do. So I encourage you, since the show obviously is no longer up, please check out the link. I can always send this PowerPoint later, and you can walk through the space and see the works, all the works that I'm talking about, and many, many more. This is the final room in the New York iteration of the show. And as I showed before, there's Mickalene Thomas's work on the left. For me, one of my primary research tasks on this project was to identify, or try to identify, the subject of the Matisse work in the middle. That's a Matisse cutout. And then of course, this is the French version of the show, which was a much more expanded show and focused a bit more heavily on the Francophone world. So that is all I had. And obviously, if there's questions or comments, I think the chat there's a question.
Hey,
let's see.
Okay, I'm back.
Open it.
Thank you,
yeah.
Heather. That was awesome. Very cool. What a cool
Thank
project.
Yeah, it was great.
We have a question from Lindley that says, how did the Rosenwald Fund that sent Augusta Savage to France begin? Do you know?
Yeah, well, actually, I was going to say, connecting to my current project, the Rosenwald Fund was created to support African-American artists during a period in which post-Civil War, during Reconstruction, many African-American artists were struggling. And so, you know, like in many cases with white American artists, this sort of the experience one would get from traveling to France, studying the old masters, studying at the academy, was kind of unparalleled. And so the funders believed that that similar experience should be able to take place with African-American artists. And Elizabeth Catlett, who is the artist I'm exploring in my upcoming exhibition, was also a recipient of the Rosenwald Fund Fellowship, and was able to, with that money, travel to Mexico to create her series, The Black Woman, which consists of 15 prints. And that would not have been the case otherwise. So it was quite forward thinking to acknowledge the importance of traveling and to get outside of one's immediate space or even one's country. In the case of Catlett, it was to go to Mexico. For many of these African-American artists, it was to go to France, to really take what they could learn from those places and hopefully bring back to the United States to then nurture and build on the African-American art community that existed there.
Thank you. Okay, I have another question for you from Julie Perotti. It says, hi, Heather, great talk. What a wonderful project for you to be a part of. Posing Modernity focuses primarily on the Black female model. Did you research much the Black male figure in European art in the 19th and early 20th centuries?
Yeah, so I did not personally, but because the exhibition was able to be quite a bit bigger in the French version, I know that that was more prioritized in that version of the exhibition. And there's a number of works in French collections that depict Black figures. And so while Denise's focus was more on Dr. Morel, I know her, so I call her Denise. Dr. Morel's focus was very much on the female body. In the New York iteration, my other colleagues in France were very interested in exploring and expanding that to think about Black models, you know, regardless of gender.
Cool. Paul says, wonderful talk. Augusta Savage, Gammons is one of my favorite pieces, he says. Thank you, Paul.
That's one of my favorites too, so.
Yes. We have one more from Lily. Many white artists who went to Paris to study came from wealthy families. Was that true of many of the African-American artists, or did most of them depend on funding, like the Rosenwald?
Yeah, I think that a number of the artists that I showed came from what we would consider at the time middle class families. So there was not necessarily affluence, but there was the ability for them to go to art school, right? Or to be able to travel within the United States. But obviously, to receive, for many of the artists may not have been able to afford that, or maybe not to afford longer periods abroad. The Rosenwald funding was quite critical. And then there were a number of scholars or number of artists who were able to receive funding multiple times as well. So it wasn't necessarily a one and done deal. And thanks, Emily.
Yeah. I have a question for you. Do you know, and I know that a lot, like some of our museum friends are here too. Do you know if there's ever been an exhibition of Tanner works all together?
Oh, there's been a number of exhibitions on Tanner. As far as where they've been, I don't believe any within this region. But of course, Emily was working on an exhibition on Tanner, and maybe she can speak to her experience.
She might know. Well. Yeah.
And sure, there was one, gosh, was it 2013? I think Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts organized it, and it traveled to the MFA Houston. So it was a project that I site curated and am very, very passionate about. That is the most recent big Tanner show that I can think of. There may be another one in the works, I'm not sure, but it was brilliant. And Heather showed some of the works that were in that exhibition. What was great about that show was that the Lazarus painting that was acquired by the Musée D'Orsay during, after he painted it, rarely leaves France. And so it did travel in the show. It was a great gift to everybody to see it.
Cool. Thank you, Emily. Okay, Lindley has another question. Was there a Black-owned gallery in the 1800s or early 1900s to try to support Black artists? Do we know?
I am not aware of any. And of course, when I think of Black-owned galleries, I think galleries that are way more contemporary. I'm thinking of, I'm from Washington, D.C. So one thing that I'm particularly proud of is that D.C. used to house the Barnett Aiden Gallery, which was a Black-owned gallery that was active in the latter half of the 20th century and supported a number of the artists that I've mentioned today, but Catlett, as well as sort of artists working kind of in the mid to late 20th century. I think one thing that's particularly interesting to me is that in exploring kind of this topic a bit in my master's thesis, the idea that Black-owned spaces or Black collectives in some cases dissolved. In the case of the Little Paris group, it dissolved, we believe, around the mid 1950s, in part because these artists were beginning to be accepted into mainstream institutions. They came out of, the lack or the ability to not be able to show their work in segregated cities. And so they created that space for themselves in these informal spaces. But as society progressed and as institutions like the Smithsonian began to accept artists of color, in some cases, the original idea behind those collectives and those Black spaces began to be less needed because there was acceptance where there originally was not. But as far as 1800s and 1900s, I don't know, but I'd be curious to learn more. But I think the Barnett Aiden Gallery is a really fascinating example of Black-led spaces. And so if you don't know about it, there's been a little bit written on it. And I highly suggest looking into that as well.
Great, thank you. I have a question for Julie. Julie, if you're there, do we have the Posing Modernity catalog at the Dixon?
We do, sorry. I brought it home.
Yes!
Good. You're not paying $1,000 for it.
Yeah, we've had it in the library for a while, and I was actually going to say, I know Dixon docents are free. We're not really a lending library, but docents are free to borrow from our library. And if anybody really wanted to borrow this, like if you can't find it used online for a good price, email me or Margarita, and we'd be happy to lend it to you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I knew, why did I know to ask this question? And you had it right there. Okay, cool.
And you can also
All right.
check out there's the French iteration, which is as big as that book is. That one is even bigger.
Okay.
And that
That's
one,
cool.
I believe, should be available more readily. But
yeah.
And I was going to say too, we have
Julie, you're breaking up.
for the catalog.
Can you ask again?
Oh, we have the Tanner book that Emily Neff was talking about, that exhibition catalog. We have that in our library, and another Tanner exhibition catalog that was from more like 2002 or something like that. If people are interested, you're welcome to come look through it.
Great. Thank you. Great questions. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you so much, Heather. I think I learned a lot. I'm really eager to learn more about African American depictions in art. I know we see them sometimes, and I've seen a lot of what you say, you know, like there's a painting and then everybody just talks about everybody else but the African American person. Same happens in South America and Latin America with paintings at the same time. So it's an interesting subject, and I really hope to learn more about it. Thank you so much. Everybody's saying thank you. Thank you, Emily, for being here, and Julie, everybody. Paul, thank you for always being here and joining us. Lindley, we hope you feel good soon.
Yeah.
And to everybody. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Like I said, this will be up in our YouTube channel very soon. And if you have any questions about any of this, feel free to email me or Julie, and we'll be happy to put you in contact with Heather too if you have questions. Thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, everybody.
Thanks, Heather.
Bye. Hopefully we'll see you at the Dixon very soon, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.